Sim. Olá, sou Camila Nunes
Hello,
Dias.
I am Camila
Recebam
Nunes.
nossos cordiais
We would like to
cumprimentos.
extend our warm welcome. We're pleased you join us when we would like to express my solidarity with the 4,000 COVID victims in Brazil because they have collapsed our hospitals and we have a sanitary and political and social crisis. It is a great pleasure to have your presence in these webinars on the constraint border area and by Inside Crime Development. This is a six-part event series in which our team has been presenting the results for extensive research into transnational organized crime in these two border areas. This work has fundamental impact. We're going to work, we'll be talking about the crime. The work was developed by Insight Crime with the Sao Paulo's Nucleus of Violence Studies from the University of Sao Paulo. We're going to work with human rights. We have debates. This event is being transmitted, broadcasted to Inside Crime Facebook page in English and Spanish. We invite you to participate by sharing your questions in YouTube, chat, and via our social media accounts on Twitter and Facebook. All of you joining us for today's event can participate in the debate by using the hashtag bordercrime. This event is divided into three parts, beginning with a presentation on the main trends of transnational organized crime in Brazil. Then we will look at the states most affected by the criminal dynamics by using an interactive map. Finally, we will present an analysis of the relationship between cross border crime and corruption. Joining us today are Inside Crime co director Steve Dudley and Inside Crime researcher and collaborator Vinicius Madureira. I will moderate the conversation as a professor at the Federal University of ABC and a researcher at the Center for Violence Studies at the University of Sao Paulo. And I'm now going to give the floor to the co-director from Stephen Dudley. Thank you, Camila. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm Steven Dudley, a co-founder and co-director of Inside Crime, along with Jeremy McDermott. I am grateful to be here with you today. I wanted to talk a little about this project and the interactive side that accompanies it. The idea behind this effort was to investigate the two tri-border zones: the Northern Triangle, made up of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, and the tri-border region of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina. For this project, we outline all the borders. We have Impact, they sponsored. We profiled all the border states, 39 in total, of these two regions. We also analyze the criminal economies present and the criminal actors who manage them. The research included extensively field research, which was unfortunately interrupted by the COVID pandemics. A great part of the results of this work are on our website, where we all have all the elements of the research: state profiles, data on homicides, profiles of the main criminal actors, on the nature of criminal economies. Much of this information is presented on the interactive map. To show you the map, how the map works, we are going to share with you a video. We invite you to visit the site and do your own searches. We organized this event today to show you a summary of the results of our field research in Brazil. After each presentation, you're going to have the space to make questions. Unfortunately, there is no simple solution to these criminal challenges, but we firmly believe that the answer must be strategic, long term, and based on lasting regional and international cooperation. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll turn the floor now back to Camila. Camila. Thanks, Steve. The publication of this study on transnational criminal activities in Brazil is timely as important criminal dynamics have presented themselves in Brazil in recent years. We invite you to encourage the audience to participate in the events as well, posting their questions and reflection in real time directly in the YouTube chat. Now, I will turn things over to Steve, who will present the criminal dynamics on the national level. Steve, thank you very much, Camilla. I'm going to talk about the criminal dynamics observed over the last 2 years. The period in which we conducted the research specifically, I'll focus on a single group, which for us is a good way to introduce a number of issues that affect the country as a whole. Obviously, this group is the first capital command and its recent expansion. In fact, the PCC's expansionist movement is what caught our attention the most. Well, obviously, the group was strong before. For many years, the group had a strong presence inside and outside the prison system. It grew thanks to its control over that system, particularly in the state of Sao Paulo, where it has some 10,000 members. It also grew by controlling the famous biqueiras, drug expedition markets. Over time, they consolidated their power over their criminal activities and managed to impose a regulation of crime in the areas under their control, leading them to a reduction in violence rates where the group exercised its hegemony. Well, now they have the ambition to control more transnational drug routes, at the same time dominate other economies like contraband and cigarette smuggling. In recent years, the group consolidated itself as the most successful Brazilian criminal organization by trafficking large quantities of cocaine and marijuana. For this reason, its members have increasingly been working to maintain a permanent cross-border drug flow in order to supply important consumer, domestic, and foreign illegal markets for consumers, national or international. With that, drug dealers have hired specialized people in logistics, both at the border as well as in the harbor area that they accept to work for them in exchange for a good amount of money. And they help in the sending of cocaine to Europe and other continents. The expansion of PCC is not limited to Brazil only. Vinicius will be talking about that in the second part of the presentation. Well, why PCC expanded now? Well, we have several answers to that question itself. In the first place, the prison system in Brazil is saturated. From 2000 to 2019, population in prisons increased in a fourfold. Within these prisons, PCC is located for inmates just as the only way to improve their living conditions in the face of an inherently violent prison system and the groups in it. The expansion of the first capital command across the country is not simply a consequence of prisoners increasingly joining the PCC, but also by the actions of public powers to transfer prisoners of these gangs to other Brazilian cities. and other states throughout the years. Both factors catalyzed the group's geographical expansion in the country, as well as their criminal actions. In the second place, there was a change in the cocaine economy. Many of the routes that previously went directly to countries to the north shifted to countries in the southern hemisphere, as is the case of the inclusion of Brazil. The introduction of direct routes headed north contributed to this shift. This change was also due to the increase in drug use itself in Brazil and the increase of users in Europe, where cocaine market experienced the most growth. Thirdly, there is a PCC model. The first capital command is structured, give greater independence to the performance of members of that criminal group. It is sufficient for its members to remain within the group's guidelines. For example, the PCC members do their illegal business in a more flexible manner without the bosses necessarily knowing about it or having to give the endorsement to the group as a whole. If they continued and followed abode by the roots, they would have some rules. For example, as the golden rule of PCC is that the organization must always receive a portion of the illicit gain from any criminal activity so that they can keep their structure running and buy more drugs, more weapons, and provide support to families visiting group prisoners. In other words, the PCC is a group with a more horizontal than rather vertical structure, which facilitates its expansion. That expansion of the PCC has real consequences in the criminal world. The first was the breakdown of relations between the country's strongest criminal gangs, the PCC and the Red Command. This rupture led to an explosion of violence within and outside the Brazilian prison system. There were other divisions, such as that between the CV and the family of the North. What we could see, what can we say about this is that the way that the PCC sets forth their homogeneity, be it in the criminal world in the street or within the prison system, violence tends to decrease. As you can see in the map, violence continues in some places like Mato Grosso do Sul when competitivity among groups is very high. PCC is long to set up to rule the whole region. The second consequence of the expansion of the PCC is that the group it appears to be a model for the other organized criminal gangs in Brazil, which emulate the actions of the Sao Paulo group within and outside the prisons, as is the case of the Family of the North. The Family of the North is currently considered as the second most important criminal group in the country. It's an organization that uses the same tactics, the same recruitment methods, the same form of treatment of prisoners' families, and so forth. In addition, they have used this control within prisons in the northern region to also consolidate the dominance over the cocaine routes. Nevertheless, the group also has some problems to keep the union, and other analysts say that the group does not exist anymore. Of course, it does exist because they have other models of organizations in the criminal underworld. To name just one, we could talk about the militias, a fundamentally different group that participate in criminal economies that are not subject of analysis of our research. And on that, Camila, I will open a space for to answer some questions. Thank you very much, Stephen. It's very interesting. Okay, I have a lot of questions, but we also want to talk about and share with the public. I'm going to ask a couple of questions and some that we have in our chat, and then we'll suspect your participation. so we can continue with the talk. Something interesting that has always uh, that makes me reflect on the PCC, and you mentioned, is that is the horizontality of the organization and verticality of the organization, linked to the network that the PCC makes up, and the independence and autonomy to act from their members to act. That is to say, they can make business for themselves. But for me, I mean, it's very blurred to understand to which point that autonomy goes and which are the limits to which they set forth that division line that they cannot cross, that the red line, will they could be at risk to be subject to certain repercussions or reprimands. So, what is the PCC as a group, and what is it individually with regards to individual businesses? That is something important, and I would like to ask you that question. Well, we have another reflection here when we talk about the authorities in Brazil, and when we talk about the Attorney General's office, when we all talk about control of the PCC on routes and control attempts and hegemony in the routes. How is it that we could define what is the PCC and what belongs to PCC and what's something that is a private business from the members? What's the evidence we have that we could follow in order to think and talk about control or domain on the route? There are other questions, but I'll try to talk to you here. But I'll pass on to you, Steve. Which is the most important characteristic of the PCC that facilitated its expansion? How they have exercised the power in the prison system, and which are the side effects that you can perceive in the with regards to the organization. There are many questions, Steve, but I would like to listen to you. I mean, what's your point is about that? So, okay, I'm going to be talking about the independence and with regards to the collective part of the PCC, and I'll leave Vinicius to answer the second question. With regards to the PCC, if it's a PCC group, if they're acting as a group as a whole, or if they're acting at individual level, we are not sure. Okay, it's a problem because so if the authorities they want to do something against the PCC, they don't know if they're affecting the PCC itself as a group, or they're just affecting or targeting, they are consolidating actions directly against small groups that don't have anything to do with PCC, or they're not acting in developing the PCC's business. So, in many ways that we could act, they could act, the PCC may act, is they're developing three things that they're doing at the same time. That is to say, a group could be doing activities that have an earning for them, illicit, and they could also be developing certain criminal activities that are also good for the leaders, for the PCC, and they have a contribution in the infrastructure or other things belonging or pertaining to the PCC. And it could be that the same individual is developing some actions, criminal actions, that are for him himself. So I think that it is something very important in a way, but we also could get lost in that debate. I think that the PCC's point that makes a difference in the PCC from other groups, what makes a difference is that possibility to act at those different levels at the same time. Because in the other groups that we investigate, we research in the region, they don't have that possibility. So, in the way you see a group, to expand himself as PCC expanded, as they did, they divide, they break apart. They don't have, the members don't have the capacity to keep the union. But PCC is increasingly strengthened. It's a contradiction within the world, the criminal world. Okay, someone give the word to Vinicius to answer the second question. So that's a very good question because it takes us to question the structure, the model, and we could see that within the prison system in Brazil, they have a lot of criminal dynamics, starting from the penitentiary system. We could see that with the PCC, when they start settling up in the trans-border crime, they manage to do that because they have more access to other criminal economies with certain facilities, even the contraband of and smuggling of cigarettes. We can see that some leaderships from the PCC, they could act in the borderline. For example, in the case of Bolivia, they acted in that region independently. So we have some of the evidences. They have certain dominion on the prison system in each of the countries they act. And on the other hand, beyond borders, for example, in Paraguay, they have representatives. So, for example, so we have Fuminho, it's transnational case, and below him we would have we'll have in that criminal dynamics we have our own their own contracting and hiring of specialists, and they could work for them, being in the border area or in the harbor area, and probably and they dominate one way or another those routes. So we have certain evidences of leadership in border countries. For example, Fuminho, who was he's acting in Mozambique. So, and we found evidence of hiring systematically a specialist in trans-border transportation, and they have certain earnings. It's temporarily, but they have that, and they end up being recruited to work for the criminal group. Yes, there are some evidences there, and it's okay. Well, that's the answer, probably not holistic to your questions, but yeah, this is an approach to that. Thank you very much, Vinicius. Okay, now it's a very complex discussion to develop. We could get lost in translation to so call it, but we could have the complexity of the PCC. But I think it's important for us to define and which is the scope of action that the PCC has. We don't have yet an answer for that, but it's an important question to answer, Vinicius. So just a little comment. Fuminho was not a member of the PCC, but he was a partner. He helped, but he was not member itself. So, but I want to make a couple of questions here that came from the audience for Steve. Could the PCC consider as a special kind of franchise? Which are the features of the PCC's control in other countries for Vinicius? Do you have knowledge about the actions of PCC in Europe, specifically in Portugal? Okay. With regards to the first question, if we consider PCC as kind of franchise, definitely yes. Since it's a more horizontal organization, we could talk about the expression franchise, but the certain franchise they have to follow the rules of the group, and if they have problems with the leaderships or with the big bosses, they may face certain serious problems, even get killed. But I think that it is a good way to talk about the PCC as a franchise and the brand. Apart from that, it's a criminal brand that is increasingly gaining more space and makes it easier to open other franchises, even in places like Paraguay. So it is a good way to talk about the PCC, to talk about a franchise. Now, with the features that they may present in terms of control that the PCC may have in other countries, I think that they are the same that they try to implement in Brazil. In the case of Paraguay, we saw that PCC began in the prison system in Brazil, and there they, little by little, they look for recruitment and for partners and even members who are from other nationalities. So not only they are not only in Brazil today, they're members of the PCC, but also they're from Paraguay. So that makes it very difficult for authorities because authorities respond to PCC in Paraguay, for example. They for example, send back people from Paraguay to other countries. They cannot reject or simply send back to their countries because even because those from Paraguay are also members of the PCC. They expand themselves, so they could be exploited for that. They have a very strong pressure on that, and on the border with cities like Pedro Juan Caballero, Ponto Roja. That point there is the most important point for cocaine traffic, and it's a very important point for the marijuana traffic. So they work inside the prison, but they also work outside prison, and they work within Brazil and outside of Brazil. Okay, yes, to answer that question, so with regards to the presence of Portugal, I'm going to talk about this question. So for me, he was a representative there. Within the different reports that we have seen that there are within Brazil certain criminal dynamics developed to this international perspective. Nevertheless, we're having a lot of Brazilians there. They have certain representatives. We have small groups with great partners who are specialized criminals. Perhaps Firmino was one of those. So he began working, he had access to markets in Europe. So we don't say exactly that the PCC is present from the as a faction, as a group there within that criminal dynamics, within rooted in Portugal. Nevertheless, we could say that PCC ends up working there through the representatives or leaderships or allies they use and they realize that they could work there. That's the dynamic. They look for representatives, for leaders, for partners who work in field within Brazil, and they work from them. They get some contacts somewhere else who act there indirectly. So that's they have certain partners, and they have that kind of link. So we cannot say directly the PCC is in Portugal. Right. Oh, it's very interesting because PCC they report that they have representatives in different countries in Europe, in almost all of the countries in South America, the United States. But I understand, as you said, the Vinicius that is now the PCC that's present in these countries, but it's one or two or three members of the PCC. So let's say that they are contact points from the PCC, but not exactly structured. I would say that Steve, now I have another question for Steve from our audience. If you could talk a little bit more of which level they have the cooptation of authority. What is the influence they have? They will have a dispersed initiative from the PCC, or they have a centralized strategy and coordinated strategy to talk about leadership and what's the relationship with the authorities, the official
Bom,
authorities.
e eu acho que
Well, I think that
tem duas possibilidades
there are two
aí,
possibilities
que o
there,
mesmo PCC
that the
faz
PCC
negócios
itself
diretamente
makes businesses
com as
directly with
autoridades ou
authorities,
coopta
or
parte
they
das
cooptate
autoridades, por
part of the
exemplo, da
authorities. They,
polícia
for example, the
ou
police,
parte do
or
promotores de
or
justiça, por
from
exemplo, né? Mas também tem a
prosecutors.
possibilidade
We
por
also have the
trás da
possibility that
polícia
the
ou
police
as mesmas
itself, or
autoridades
the
estão
authorities
fazendo
themselves, are
negócios no
making
negócio do
businesses
PCC.
out of the business of the
Posso
PCC.
falar de um
I
caso
could
do governo de
say,
São
I could
Paulo,
talk about a case
onde
in Sao Paulo
encontraram
in which they found
53 membros da
53
polícia
members
mesmo
of the
que está
police
fazendo negócios
who are making
na venda
businesses on
das
the sale
drogas
of
através
drugs
do
of
PCC. Então,
from the small distributors, drug
estão
markets, biqueiras, they call them in Portuguese,
extorsionando,
and
mais ou
they
menos
are
extorsionando os membros
blackmailing
do
quite the
PCC
members of the
quando
PCC
eles
when
capturaram
they seized, they
do PCC, por exemplo.
handcuffed a
Então,
member from the PCC.
existe
Or,
uma
so
crença
there is belief
uma
that there's only
questão
one
de
question of
cooptação do
cooptation
PCC
or
das
influence from
autoridades, que
of the PCC on
acontece,
the authorities. What happens?
obviamente, mas
Obviously,
também acontece
but it also takes
a mesma
place the
polícia,
fact
as
that the
mesmas
police
autoridades
themselves, the
também
authorities
está fazendo
themselves, they're
negócios
making
no
businesses
negócio
out of the business
ilícito do
of the
PCC.
PCC, illicit activities.
Vinícius, você quer complementar?
Vinicius, would you like to
Não, eu ia
complement?
complementar
No,
justamente esse
we
ponto
just want to
sobre
talk,
policiais
elaborate
em
on
São
that point
Paulo
from
que
the police
adquiriam
in Sao Paulo.
terrenos, eles extorsionavam
They
membros da
blackmailed,
PCC
they extortioned some of the members
só
of the
responder
PCC.
rapidamente. Ah, mas o
Um,
Steve já falou muito bem.
Steve already mentioned
Bom,
the topic
obrigada.
itself.
Então, a gente
Okay, thank you
passa
very much.
agora
So
para a
now we're going to
segunda
be talking
parte,
about
né,
to the
desse
second
evento,
part
dessa
of this
apresentação, e
event
eu
of this
passo para o
presentation,
Vinícius
and I'm going to give the word to
falar sobre
Vinicius
a questão
to
dos
talk
estados
about
fronteiriços.
the border states.
Obrigado, Camila.
Thank you very much,
Bom, o Steve
Camila.
falou,
Well,
né, introduziu
Steve
a gente
talked
a
about the
expansão do
introduction
grupo
of the
da
expansion of
capital
the
em nível
first
nacional.
capital
Eu vou
command.
falar um pouco da
We're going to
expansão
talk
do
about the
PCC
expansion of the
propriamente na fronteira.
PCCs and the
Então,
border.
de fato, grande
In
parte da
fact,
expansão
a
do
great part of the
ataque do
expansion
grupo
of the
em
group
direção à fronteira oeste
towards the
se
border,
deu pelo
it was
encarceramento em
given due
massa
to
de membros do
the
PCC
imprisonment of
entre o
members of
estado de São
PCC
Paulo e o
in the
Paraguai,
state of Sao
no
Paulo and
Paraná e Mato
Paraguay,
Grosso do Sul,
in
que
Paraná
são
and
as
Mato Grosso do
principais rotas
Sul,
de entrada de
are the
contrabandeados de
main
drogas no
entrance
país.
routes for drug
Por
dealing.
isso, não
For that
podemos deixar
reason,
de
we
lembrar
cannot leave
que o controle
aside
prisional
that the
nesse
prison
estado
control in these
permitiu
states
cada vez
allowed
mais que o
increasingly
PCC
more
se
the
consolidasse
PCCs
em pontos
to
estratégicos da
consolidate
fronteira,
in strategic
como a
points along the
região
border
próxima ao Paraguai,
in a
dando
borderline
maior
with
aglomeração
Paraguay.
dos corredores de
So
cocaína
we have certain
contrabandeados do país,
cocaine corridors,
chamados
we
de
may
Rota
call them,
Caipira.
called
Essa
the
rota
Rota
liga
Caipira.
as
So
fronteiras da
it's
Bolívia e do
in the
Paraguai
borders
ao
of
estado do
Bolivia
Mato
and
Grosso do
Paraguay.
Sul.
We have
Então,
towards the Mato
canaliza
Grosso do
os
Sul, and they canalize that
bens ilícitos para o
and
aeroporto, especialmente
throughout the
entre São
country,
Paulo e Rio de Janeiro.
especially towards Sao
Na região
Paulo and Rio.
fronteiriça com o
But in the
Paraguai,
border area
o
with
PCC
Paraguay,
explora as rotas
PCC
já
exploits
estabelecidas
the
e
routes that are set
antecipadas
forth previously,
pelo
as
fluxo
well
da
as the
indústria da região.
infrastructure and the
A
contrabands, the
fronteira
smugglers
terrestre
throughout the
que
region. The
separa o
land
estado do
border
Mato Grosso do Sul
separates the state
do
of
país
Mato Grosso do
vizinho
Sul
é de
from
cerca de
the
800
bordering
quilômetros.
country,
Esse
nearly
ponto é vital para
700
os tráficos
kilometers.
da
So it's
cocaína
very
e
difficult
da maconha
to
mais
control.
ilícita.
And they also
Parte desse
transfer
fluxo
marijuana.
de ilícitos é
That
descarga
makes
por
part of that group,
navios
so
livres
which is
pelos
quite
meios
small
aéreos
scale,
ou pelos barcos,
in
chamados
air through
de
airplane.
mochileiros.
And they
Barcos
also
assim
have two
que às
people
vezes
who work with
são
that, with human
diversos
carriers.
carregamentos
So we
diários
have,
passando pelo
anyways,
flutuante,
different
que faz com
cargoes
que grandes
that
volumes
makes
acabem
big
passando
volumes and passing
por
or
essa fronteira.
transpassing that border.
É importante dizer
It is
que,
important to say
apesar da
that
relevância desse
despite the
corredor
relevance of this
para o tráfico de
corridor
drogas, o
for
grupo
drug
paulista não
dealing,
conseguiu
the
dominar
Paulista group,
completamente a região.
they have not
Uma das
managed the whole
razões é a
region.
presença
one of the greatest presences in that area in the world of crime. The Red Command, as well as the small family groups for the businesses, they continue exercising influence in the criminal dynamics of the region. We have seen different groups acting now in this dispute for power, mainly. Yeah, for example, we have George Rafa in the border, his organization. They created a violence dynamics. Today, at the present, for example, nearly 50% of homicides that take place throughout Paraguay take place in the cities, in border cities with Brazil. We still have a long concern because the homicide rate is double now. Um, in the northern part, we have 21, 22 people martyred for each 100 inhabitants in the borderline. The expansion of PCC for the border in Paraguay and Bolivia generated as a consequence special expansion in the northern part of the country with pressure set by criminal groups and with the vigilance of public forces themselves over the routes that pass through the state of Mato Grosso do Sul. We know the first capital command going all the way to Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, they are very useful. So they open the space somehow so that the first capital command and the red command and the family of the north, for them to explore more frequently alternative routes towards the north of the country. Because that's why they have a dispute for the Solimões River route, which connects several Peruvian cities with Amazon's capital Manaus, and it goes all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. It's an important point of dispute among these organizations. Also, in the northern part, we have certain ports. We have the PCM's harbor, for example, in Ceará. So it's criminal dynamics that changed a little bit. Yeah, and where the PCC has gained power. So we have also Mato Grosso do Sul. In all these, for us, well, basically when we have a deep destabilization of the region in terms of security and corruption. So we have, for example, very continuous massacres of people there because criminality has grown a lot. But even so, the presence of the first capital command on the border with Paraguay, especially in the city of Ponta Porão, has side effects on the criminal economies related to traffic and smuggling and control of that corridor as a whole. The smugglers have been continuously jailed by the judicial system in the region. And due to the lack of prison system, where the first capital command exercises control, they have a window of opportunities so that the Comando Capital, first capital command, they exercise certain control on those smugglers, especially those who smuggle or contraband with cigars. They have a very strong economy that moves millions of reais. So this is a dispute to dominate that criminal economy. Currently, we have a big criminal organizations, but that work and exercise that contraband flow in those border regions. Along the borders, we have the presence, for example, the presence of some small groups like highly specialized in the transport of drugs in a systematic way. These groups specialize in the transport of drugs, to work for the PCC. They work. Could they also work with weapons, cigarettes, or drugs? They have infrastructure, personnel, and a well-designed system. The PCC and other criminal groups have been hired to transport their illegal goods, to have that illegal market. And this is a threat and those groups start changing the routes and the way they act. So they adapt increasingly. So they act differently in the northern part of. They were in Mato Grosso do Sul, and now they work in the southern part in the Paraná border. So they have special actions developed in that region. And their members themselves, they work independently, so they could develop their own activities and strategies. So we have an example, for example, a hijacking of a transporter. Well, we remember that Prosegur in Paraguayan in the city of Ciudad del Este, which included the theft of $12 million. Uh-huh. This case caught our attention because, despite the extent of the theft, the members who participated in the attack, they didn't need either direct support or prior approval from the PCC's senior hierarchy. And it is there, but they're not so strong to control the criminal activities from the group. And with that, Camila, we're going to leave space open for the other questions, and I'll give the floor to you.
Obrigada, Vinícius.
Okay,
Eu vou fazer uma
okay.
pergunta e
I'm going to
depois,
ask a question,
próxima
and
pergunta
then we have
tá?
several other questions
E
from
aí a
our
gente vai
audience.
fazendo
And there,
alguns
we're
conjuntos
going
de
to make a
perguntas para
couple of
responder
questions
para
for
ficar
you to
muita
answer,
coisa junto.
and not to have the
Uma
whole thing
questão que eu queria
together.
fazer
One
para o
question that I wanted
Vinícius
to ask for
foi uma
Vinicius
questão
is
que ele
about
mencionou
the
dessa
question that you
morte
talked
do
about the
rapaz,
death of
em
Rafaz in
2016.
2017.
Eu vejo que o
I
rapaz
see that
ele
Rafat,
era
he
o rei da
kept,
fronteira,
he
ele
was
mantinha
called
ali
the
uma
king of the
certa ordem
border.
social
And
na
so
região,
he
né?
kept that
Ele
social order
fazia,
in the
digamos
region.
assim,
He
uma
was pretty
regulação
much, he
social
regulated
muito
socially the
similar à que o
region,
PCC
similar
faz
to
em São
what the
Paulo.
PCC
É
has in
diferente,
Sao
né? Eles são
Paulo,
coisas
obviously,
diferentes,
in different
mas, digamos,
contexts,
fazem um
but
papel muito similar.
they have
E com
a
a morte
similar
dele,
role
né?
with his
Não
death.
sei o que você acha.
Wow, okay.
Na
What
minha
do you think
visão,
is
o
going to
PCC
happen?
não
In my vision,
consegue
PCC
impor essa
does not,
regulação
cannot
social,
get
porque ali
to
realmente uma
achieve
zona
that
justamente uma
regulation,
zona
social regulation,
de
because it's
passagem
a
e não de
this is just a
circulação. Então, o
transitional
PCC não
route for the
consegue
PCC, so
impor
they
uma
cannot
regulação social
manage
ali.
to
E
regulate
hoje, essa
socially
região,
the
até hoje,
environment
ela
there.
é
So
um
far,
ponto ali de
it's
intensa
just
disputa,
a
né?
very
De intensos conflitos violentos.
disputed
E
area
é
because they
justamente um
have a lot
corredor
of
muito
conflicts, because this is
importante
also a
para o
very important
escoamento das
corridor
mercadorias que vêm do
for
Paraguai,
the
Paraguai
trafficking
como
of
entreposto,
goods from
especialmente
Paraguay,
assim, aquilo que
especially
vem para
in that
a
comes
região sudeste do
from the
Brasil. Queria que você
southeast
falasse um
region
pouquinho sobre
in
isso.
Brazil.
E aí eu vou
Could you
fazer
talk
algumas
about
das
that?
perguntas aqui,
And I
né?
pass on some of the questions at the end here
Para o
from our
Vinícius
audience
também.
for
O
Vinicius too.
PCC tem
PCC
ações e
has
relações
some actions
ações ou relações de influência com outros
regarding or
grupos
influence with other
no
groups
Uruguai,
in
inclusive
Uruguay,
grupos criminosos
even
operando no
criminal groups
Uruguai.
that are
Queria que você falasse
operating
um pouquinho
within
sobre o
Uruguay. Could
PCC
you
no
talk
Uruguai.
about that? Could you
E o
elaborate about
Vinícius,
that? For
sabe se
Steve,
o
do
PCC
you know if
teve,
we know that
e assim,
PCC,
são mais
and
jovens que
yeah,
o
I think
PCC,
they're
que
younger
o
than the
CVV,
CV,
que
the
continua tão
Red Command,
fortes
and they
quanto
continue as
antes.
strong as
Como o
they
CVV
are.
atua no mercado
How
atualmente?
the Red Command acts in the
Eu quero interferir um pouquinho na sua
currently. I just want to
pergunta,
interfere a little
mas
bit in
o
this
PCC
question.
não
So I
está
think
tão
that
forte
the
quanto
Red
antes,
Command
ao
is not as
contrário,
strong
né?
in the
Acho que
south.
depois a
On
gente
the
pode falar um
contrary,
pouquinho do
uh,
CV, mas o
you may
PCC tem
elaborate on that. The CV or
uma
the Red
estrutura,
Command, they
tem
have a
uma dupla
structure
estrutura
or
bastante diferente
a
em relação
very
ao
different
PCC
structure
e, de fato,
compared to the
ele é um
PCC.
grupo
And as a matter
bastante
of fact,
fragmentado, né?
it's a very
De toda forma,
fragmented group.
eu gostaria que o Steve
So I would
falasse um
like that
pouquinho,
Steve talked a little bit about
embora o
this.
foco tenha sido o
So
PCC, mas o
even
PCC
though if
entrou,
the
né,
focus
no
is the
CV nessa
PCC,
pesquisa.
what's the
Outra
control of the
pergunta
Red
para o
Command in
Steve.
that area? Another
Você
question for
considera
Steve.
as ações
Do
do
you
PCC
consider that
similares aos
PCC's
grupos
actions are similar to
terroristas?
those
Quais
of the
seriam as
terrorist
semelhanças e
groups?
as
Which would be the
diferenças?
similarities and differences?
Outra pergunta
Another
para
question
o
for
Vinícius. Não, desculpa.
Vinicius.
A mesma
Okay,
pergunta
sorry.
também
Oh,
essa.
please answer. I'm making a lot of questions here. I'm sorry about that. So now, but well, okay. Please proceed with your answers,
Mais duas, depois
and
eu
then we'll
faço
go.
segunda rodada.
Okay, and I'll make
Vinícius,
the other questions in the second round. Okay, it was very specific with Rafa's death. So they had some dominion in the region, but even though that domain they had, it was irregular and it generated violence. It was noticed by us that members of the PCC who didn't work, or that even if they didn't know about the Rafah's dominion there, they know they had some space open in cases, for example, Rafah, if he was looking for some ambushments there for all the criminals in the region. I think that the regulation was so big, so strong, that as a matter of fact, he knew who would get in and who would get out within the controlled area in the territory. And he managed to even he even got to the medicine faculty in the region. He had some space control that was very strong, and the social regulation that was still very strong. About the second question, about Uruguay's activities. The criminal dynamics in Brazil, it ends up going back to uh, prison system. Within the South, they have certain groups that are different from the first Red Command that act there. They organize one way or another that dynamic. So we see the PCC is very shy somehow, very introverted in that region compared to the Red Command with the traffic of drugs. They are a facilitator of to develop criminal activities in the region. So Uruguay is a country that we don't hear much about them, about traffic, but it's recently growing. So it is worth mentioning, but I do believe that the action of PCC in Uruguay, yes, it takes place. It is similar to the acting of the group in Rio Grande do Sul in that state. But they are basically a facilitator of that criminal dynamics within that country, but it is not something that should be a concern to keep looking at that. So they are helping as facilitators of criminal activities in Uruguay, but we would not say that is strictly directly acting within Uruguay. And now I'm going to give Steve the
Bom,
word. Well,
a primeira pergunta
the
será
first
sobre
question is with
esse
regards
tempo
to the
evidente, né?
PCC or
Esse é o mais
FDN,
jovem que eu
which they were
sei
younger
ver.
than the
Obviamente, eu
Red
sei
Command.
que o
Obviously, the
grupo
Red Command
histórico,
is the
então
historic group,
tem essa aparência
so they
de
have
ser
that appearance
mais
of being
velhos, deve
older,
ter pessoal
and they should
bem
have
mais,
people who
sabe,
have more
o pessoal
years
que está no
than a
FDN.
lot of people who
Além
are
disso,
in the
eu vi que tem
FDN. They have
uma apresentação
a presentation
diferente, né? Que
that's different.
eles querem fazer
They want
a diferença entre
to
os
make a
grupos
difference
mais
among the
velhos
groups, the
e
older
assim
groups,
eles podem
so they can
trazer mais
bring
recrutamento, né?
more
Então,
recruitments.
eu acho que
So I
eles
think
se
that
posicionam
they
como
are positioned
um
as
grupo mais
a
jovem,
a
mas
younger
pode
group,
ter um pouco de
but they
tudo,
should
né? A
have
gente
a
não
little bit
tem
of everything.
uma
We
ideia
don't have
certa
a clear idea
da membresia
of the
do
memberships of the city
FDN,
of
então
FDN,
a gente não
so
pode
we
falar
cannot
da ciência
talk about the
certa
essence
sobre isso, mas
certainly
a
about that. But
aparência que a
apparently,
gente pode ver
in general, that's what we could
é,
see
é
as a whole.
diferente do
The
CV
difference of the
com
CB
o
with
PCC e
or
outros
the Red
grupos
Command of
diferentes,
PCC or the
pelo
groups like
menos
FDN,
como a
at
FDN
least
estava
FDN, they were positioning
posicionando
themselves
antes, é
before,
que o
is
CB
that
trabalhava muito
the
com
Red
a
Command
ideia de
worked a lot
controlar
with the idea of
o
controlling
território,
the territory
o
or
espaço
a
geográfico
geographical
físico.
space,
Então,
physical space.
com isso,
And with
eles
that,
podiam fazer um
they
controle
could
sobre
have a
os
control
mercados
on
ilícitos,
the
os mercados
illicit markets,
criminosos.
criminal markets.
A diferença é que
The difference is that the PCC or they have a power
uma base
that has a
como você
base
falou,
that is more,
Camila,
as you
mais
mentioned,
social,
Camilla,
uma
more social
ideologia
base. They have an
que
ideology
vai mais longe
that
que
goes
a mesma
beyond
controle sobre um
the
espaço
control
físico
itself on a
que
physical
faz o
space.
CV.
that this red command has. The red command's model is falling now. It's getting old. So we talk that they don't act with so much certainty, be it in the northern part of the country, or I myself itself in Rio, when they don't have a control on the that they used to have before. It's with regards to that. I think that I would also like to discuss somehow your opinion, Camila. I would like to listen to you. So, with regards to the terrorist groups and the difference and similarities with the PCC, I think that we have certain similarities. Terrorist groups and the PCC, they make a lot of recruitments within the prison system, and within this prison system, as a second point, they could they could have an ideology that has to do with class differences and the injustice that's present in the world. And based on that ideology, they could create a stronger group, and a group that they could have, be it in Sao Paulo or other parts of the country, and it's the same ideology that they understand. The members of the group understand. They don't need to be in Sao Paulo themselves, or Rio or other parts where the PCC is present, to better understand what the ideology is like and the class differences that is the base of the ideology from the PCC itself. So, at the same time, the PCC has that function, or could have that social function, to so call it, and that social function is based both in the prison system, in the prisons or jails, with the help of families, with lawyers, attorneys, with other areas related to the prisons, and the outside part where they could have a control, so that they are the ones who are regulating violence in the areas where they have that control. So, and going back to the question you made some time ago, what does it mean to have control of the PCC? PCC has control when they are developing and they're having that regulation of violence in the area. For us, that's control.
Certo. Obrigada,
Right.
Steve.
Thank you very
Só um
much,
comentário
Steve.
sobre o
It's just a
CT,
comment
assim, para eu
on
poder passar para o
quickly
próximo.
to about the
Eu
FDN.
entendo
So
que
I
o
understand
CT,
that
ele
as
tem
a
uma
red
estrutura,
command, they have a
assim,
structure
uma estrutura menos
that's
estruturada,
less
comparada com
structured
o PCC, né?
compared to the
No
PCC.
Rio de
So
Janeiro,
in Rio de
tem
Janeiro, for
estudos já,
example,
né, da década de 90,
we have from the
que
90s,
indicavam que o
they
CT,
talked about
cada
the red
morro, né,
command
ele
in
tinha
each
ali um chefe dono do
hill. They
morro,
had
e
someone,
aí
they had a leader,
cada um desses chefes tinha
and each one of them
relativa
had
autonomia nos
certain
negócios, né?
autonomy in the businesses.
Então, você
So
vê, eles
the
eram
red
vinculados
command,
àqueles que
they
estavam
were linked to
presos,
that who
e era
were
uma espécie de
imprisoned,
uma
and
federação de
they had a type of
traficantes, mas
federation
sem
of
uma
drug dealers,
articulação
but
maior para
without
além
having a
dos
greater
próprios morros
articulation,
e sem uma,
um,
digamos, uma
and without
coesão, né?
any
Uma
cohesion
estrutura mais orgânica,
or a
como
more
até
organic
dentro do
structure
PCC.
as
O
presented in the
PCC,
PCC. The
paradoxalmente, apesar dele
PCC
ser
paradoxically
flexível, né?
is more
Mais,
flexible.
como você disse, de certa
It's more,
forma
as you say,
horizontal,
certain.
mas ele ao
They
mesmo
have
tempo ele tem uma
they have certain
estrutura
autonomy, but they
muito
also have a
forte no
structure that's
sentido
very
de
strong
vinculação dos
of
integrantes. Tem um
recruitment of
sistema, um sistema de
members.
controle
They
de quem
have
é
a
membro, quem não é,
system
de
to
batismo, enfim.
control, to
E isso
baptize
fez com
each
que
one,
esse
for example, to
diálogo
welcome
sempre, ao
everyone.
meu ver,
So, from my
permanecesse
standpoint,
vinculado ao
they keep
seja
themselves
absolutamente
linked, contrary to
fragmentando,
the
né?
red command. They just
Mas, qual que é a
become
outra sua
dispersed.
pergunta?
So,
Ricardo,
we have other
aproveito,
questions here.
né,
We have at least three
para,
questions
para Vinícius.
for
Vinícius,
Vinicius.
além do padrão de escrotização
Apart from the
sistematizado,
pattern in the
existem
system,
aproximadamente
in the
mais
prison
estratégias
system,
de
do they have
recrutamento de
other
pessoal
recruiting
financiado pelo PCC?
strategies from the
Outra
PCC?
pergunta,
Another
Vinícius.
question for
Qual a
Vinicius,
importância dos
which is the
voos
importance
clandestinos para o
of the
tráfico de cocaína
clandestine
para o
illegal
Brasil?
flights for
E
the
de quais
cocaine
países?
traffic towards Brazil, and from
Você,
which countries
Bolívia,
are those
Peru,
flights coming?
Paraguai, você conseguiu, né,
Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay. So,
identificar?
if you could
Uma
identify them.
pergunta do
One
BLS
question
aqui,
from
tá?
the
Também
BLS.
faço para o
So,
Steve.
no, it's for
Tem
Steve.
outros grupos We have other criminal groups whose power base is within the prison system. So urban groups, and they exercise both power in the international border. PCC is the only one. So there we have an important question here. You know very well other groups who act, especially in Central America. You wrote a book about MES 13. So I would like to listen a little bit about that on that perspective and make a comparison. So, Vinicius, the floor is yours, and then Steve, please.
Bom, de todos os
Well,
nossos estudos que a
from
gente
all our
fez, né,
studies that we
tem
found,
a
we
próprio
have
recrutamento
the recruiting
do novo
itself
sistema prisional, muito bem
and the prison
reconhecido,
system
é o que nem merece
is pretty well
crescer
perceived.
muitos mais
So,
No entanto, o recrutamento
nevertheless, the recruitment, but we are seeing now, we
está se
have
desenrolando
dynamics
hoje,
today,
principalmente por causa do
and
Covid,
mainly
que
in
as
the
viagens
because
estão
of the
menos
COVID-19 pandemics, we could see that
menos
they don't have
fluido,
many
né? O
troubles now.
transporte mudou
So
muito
they
desde
don't
a
have
saída
now
do
the
Covid.
habitual or current or
O
typical
PCC ele tem
transportation
contratado
means. The
sim
PCC has
pessoas
hired
especializadas em,
people
por
who are
exemplo,
specialized, for
fazer o
example, in
carregamento de drogas
having some
em
drugs
containers,
cargo in
seja
containers,
até
be
mesmo no
it
tráfico do
at
narcótico, ou
local
seja, esse
level
recrutamento
or also recruiting other people,
especializado que a gente
specialized
precisa
people
para se
that they need
autodifferenciar,
to
para retroalimentar
finance the and to get some feedback in their actions.
No entanto, dentro do sistema
Nevertheless,
prisional, você
within the prison system,
já vê algo
we could
como
see
a
something
única opção
like the
mesmo dele
only
sair bem
way for
sucedido.
them to be very
Ele
successful because they have their contacts
vive
there.
uma situação
So they are
dual
experiencing
ali,
a situation
um
there.
monte de
They have
facção
this
criminosa,
dualistic
e por outro
situation,
lado, o
and on the
Estado
other hand, the
ele
state
tá como
that
estrutura
is,
saturada,
as you mentioned,
então
is saturated,
fica muito fácil
and
de
it's very
você
easy
recrutar
for
novos
PCC to
membros
recruit
do
other
sistema
members
prisional.
within the
Ao
prison
passo que na
system.
rua ele
So in the
encontra
streets, they have
simpatizantes, ele
certain
encontra
people who are
periferias,
followers, and
às vezes sem vínculos, mas ele
sometimes
encontra
they don't have any
simpatizantes
link with that,
naturais,
but they
porque
find natural followers
aquele núcleo
because
social ele
they have
não
certain
encontra o Estado,
social
ele encontra o
earning,
poder público,
and they
e
could
aí a
have
outra ponta você
public
vê
power,
de fato é
and we
aquilo,
could see, as a matter of
pessoas
fact,
para escoar as drogas.
so
Então,
it's just
aqui
to
eu
filter
deixo
drugs.
breve comentário
So
para Steven.
this is a very the other comment. I'll give the word to Steve
Bom, eu
now.
acho que é uma boa
Well, I think that
pergunta
it's a
de
very good
Benedetti
question from Belis and Hyben.
Muito obrigado, eu acho, Steve.
Hola, hi Belis, and thank you for coming
A gente
to
vê
this meeting.
outros grupos
So we see other
que têm
groups
epicentro
that
de
have
atividades
an
nos
epicenter of
presídios,
activities in the prison
basicamente
system,
são
and
grupos
basically they
urbanos,
are
e eu
urban
posso falar
groups,
de
and we could
três
talk
grupos
about three main
que vem na
groups
mente nisso.
that come to my mind.
Grupo que é
One group
MS13,
that is
que é
MS13, which is
o grupo que tem uma presença
the group that has
em
presence
seis
in
países
6
do
countries
hemisfério.
in the hemisphere.
Grupo
One
que
group
é grupo parecido,
which is
tem
similar,
uma
that it
horizontalidade
has a horizontal organization similar to that of they have certain cells, they have certain independence and autonomy, but they have a very strong mark, and they work within that, within certain rules and a certain brand, to so call it, but they are not very strong in the borders. They don't have that capacity that the PCC has to interact, to make businesses with the suppliers or other groups of cocaine suppliers. They don't have infrastructure in order to bring cocaine and export cocaine. They are not a group, a criminal group, a transnational group, to talk in a simple manner. They don't have that capacity that the PCC has. The group that could have something similar to the PCC would be the Barrio Azteca neighborhood, which is a group that has presence. I was born in the prison system in the United States, and they act in the border with Mexico, mainly in the Juarez area. They had special partnership and allies with the Juarez cartel for a long time, and they had that capacity to bring borders together and have a very strong presence in transnational area with regards to drug dealing. So, but they were born in the same border. It is not that they were born in Dallas or Houston right after they went back to the border to make or develop businesses as PCC. The same thing happens with the Mexican mafia they were born in California, in the system prison in California, and they make businesses in the border with Mexico, and they have those contacts at the highest levels of organized crime, but they don't have a presence as PCC. They're not developing businesses at great scale as the PCC is doing. PCC ends up being a very unique group in that sense that they made their epicenter, their control center, the command center in the prison system, and they expanded themselves towards the borders, mainly in the border with Paraguay. And they developed those businesses with the big leagues of organized crime and other prison groups. They haven't done that yet. Okay, that's very interesting, Steve. Thank you very much. So now I'm gonna go to the third session of the presentation on the case.
Obrigado, Camila.
Okay,
Ó, antes
thank
de
you,
falar
Camila. Well,
da
before
questão que eu
that,
esqueci
I'm
de,
gonna be talking about something that I
de
forgot. So,
questões de
um,
voos, né?
talking
Mas
about the
sim, a
illegal
gente tem
flights.
notado
Yes, we have
que
noticed that
os voos
that
transfronteiriços entre a cidade
transporter
da
flights
Bolívia para
over Bolivia to the state of Mato Grosso or Mato Grosso do Sul,
recorrente, é
it's
recorrente mesmo.
very repetitive.
Inclusive aumento que a
Even
gente
we have an increase,
tem vindo a
and
gente um
we
momento
need to remember that we are undergoing a moment in which borders are open.
então
And but
ações
for the
cada
time being,
vez
they were
mais
closed, so actions are
especializadas se
increasingly more
deploram
specialized.
mais. Então, assim,
So
prosseguindo, né?
to continue,
Nas duas primeiras sessões nós
in the
falamos
first two
sobre
parts, we
essa
focus on the PCC,
mas o grupo
but the
paulista é
PCC is
uma
just
das facetas do
one
crime organizado
facet
no
of the
país.
organized crime in
Uma
Brazil.
face é
The other
controlada
side is
por poderosas
controlled
elites
by the
políticas,
country's
econômicas e
powerful
legais.
political and
Isso
economic
não quer dizer
elites.
que as
It means
autoridades
that the
não
authorities they didn't
de
do anything.
fato, as
As a matter of
investigações do
fact,
Ministério Público no
investigations by the
combate à
Attorney General's
corrupção no
office
Brasil
aim at
foram
fighting against corruption in
fortalecidas nos
Brazil
últimos anos.
improved in recent
Os
years.
desdobramentos
The
da Operação
consequences
Lava
of
Jato
Operation Lava Jato
fizeram com que
have led
parte das
some of the
elites
country's
políticas e econômicas
political and
do país
economic
começassem a
elites
ter que prestar
to begin
atenção
having
à
being held
justiça e
accountable
a
for
começar a
the before the Brazilian
respeitar a justiça
justice.
brasileira. No passado recente, isso era algo
Previously, that was something rare, even
impensável
unthinkable
para
for
a sociedade
the
brasileira.
Brazilian society.
A Lava Jato empreendeu
The
investigações
Lava Jato operation
internacional e
opened
representa
national
uma
investigations
das
and
maiores
represents one of the
ações do
largest
judiciário
actions
brasileiro,
taken by the
talvez
Brazilian
até
judicial
do
system,
país da
perhaps
América do Sul,
even of
para
the in any part
combater
of
a
South
corrupção
America,
sistêmica.
to rule the systemic
Contudo, o
corruption.
fato de seus
Nevertheless, the
desdobramentos
fact
terem sido objeto
that
da
its effect have been
politização nos últimos
politicized
anos, a operação de
led
fato
us
ela
to
existe para o
believe
bem e para o mal,
that the operation
pois ao
was done for
mesmo
both good and bad,
busca
because of
legitimidade
this. At the
e
same time,
busca
it
dar fim
aims
à
at looking
impunidade
at
daqueles
the
responsáveis
impunity of
pelos
countries'
crimes
powerful
com
businessmen and
bastante veemência.
with a lot of effort. And they have
Problemas
found a lot of problems in
tem-se
the legal
muita
within the
água
legal framework.
ainda sobre
We still could talk a lot
a
about
Operação
that
Lava Jato.
on the Lava Jato
Dessa
operation.
maneira,
In
no
that
caso
way,
de Dário
in the
Messi,
case of
chamou nossa
Daronesi,
atenção,
so it
e
called
nós
the
fizemos
attention a
um
lot,
publicado
and
sobre
we
ele.
had some case
Mas quem era
study.
Dário Messi?
But who was Dario
Ele era
Messer?
considerado
He
pelos
was
procuradores
a Brazilian prosecutor who
brasileiros
considered him
como
to be
doleiro dos
the
doleiros,
doleiro dos doleiros,
supostamente
or the
gerente
largest
dos
exchanger of dollars
uma região como
in the
o tamanho da
region,
América Latina,
pretty much the size of Latin America.
por vários
He had gone through a lot of countries in Latin America. He developed a lot of countries, moving money through hundreds of banks accounts, business and properties in Brazil and abroad. So he could make more than 1 million activities, transactions. Among his clients, he had Sergio Cabral, and the time governor of the state of Rio de Janeiro between 2007 and 2014. So Cabral is a good example of how this great money laundering system worked. First, the governor systematically inflated the value of public works contracts in exchange for the procurement of predetermined contractors. The contractors, they had used a lot of money, and they could justify, and the contractors and collusion, they paid the governor's scheme, and they gave a certain bribery, and they gave and the budget to Messers Network in Brazil, and they moved the corresponding movement of the products or the money to other countries. They had intermediaries working for Kazar to work in the other activities. With whom they had special businesses. Then he charged for the services paid. So that's why he was called Dolero, dos Doleiros, like the dollar exchanger of the dollar exchangers. Now that's why he managed to work with other people, and many people who were in his close circle. With all this system, Messer managed to launder at least 100 million reals through Cabral's activities. It's important to mention that Cabral was Messer's became Messer's client from the moment the governor failed to give more explanations for the large sums of money he received. Now let's see. In the case of Brazil, was a moment where great events were taking place in the country. We had a lot of people in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Well, it makes sense. They had access to great amounts of money, and they could not invest the money. Most of investigations indicated that Messer helped launder close to $1,600 million in illicit profits from different people. So we call that system dollar cabo or dollar cable. It's a system of an unregistered international parallel compensation system where they worked in that system. They've been working that since the 80s. Um, the Brazilian authorities moved. They would move money or capital from one of the parties' accounts in a given country, and other one would move the same amount of money or capital to the counterparty's account in another country. So, so no money would cross the borders, even in the businesses. It's not between Brazil and another country or another client within Brazil. So they didn't have to move the money cross-borderly. So, so they would move the money within the accounts there, and people would move the money here in Brazil within Brazil itself. So it was difficult to track. Each money was moved within the country. With that, so that was the system where they had a fragility of these banking systems because they could not work, but there were other practices. So even that Lava Jato represents a progress in regards to ruling in impunity within the country, within the Brazilian justice systems, when we focus the analysis on a more local, everyday level, especially in the border area, we see that Brazilian and foreign citizens who should be held accountable by Brazilian justice often flee across borders from Brazil in the direction towards Paraguay. So precisely in Bolivia, for example, Uruguay, Argentina, and it was exactly that within that context that Messer decided he left. He had some people who contacts in the neighboring countries. He flees the country and he finds shelter beyond the Brazilian borders. So To escape from the Brazilian justice, he moved to Paraguay, where he found a lot of groups that dominate the region. And we talked about Jorge Rafah before. We have people with a lot of power in that region. And so, but Messer decided to find political asylum, to isolate himself. Yeah, we have two people there. We have Rocky Fabiano. Um, he fled to Paraguay in 1999 and now allegedly has ties to different money exchange houses which have helped launder hundreds of thousands of dollars. And apart from that, he also is accused by the justice in both countries of being one of the main producers and smugglers of cigarettes on the border between Paraguay and Brazil, specifically in the city of Salto de Guairá, which we can see here on the map. So Mesut first approached Antonio, so he fixed in Salto de Guaira, and then he decides to move. He looks for he's looking for Antonio Joaquim de la Mota, and his family clan. They have the same name of the group. He has links with drug trafficking in the region. He has a lot of businessmen's house, and the authorities found a lot of evidence that he would be trafficking with the drugs. In addition, there was evidence of entrepreneurs ties to Minotauro group, which was one of the PCC's leaders in the region, who was captured in recent years in 2019. And he didn't stop there. Master also came to connect with people of high caliber in Paraguay, such as the former president and now current Senator Horacio Cartes, seeking protection from incursion by Brazilian authorities. But in this case, it became increasingly evident. He returned to Brazil, where he ended up being prosecuted. Um, and he ended up returning to Sao Paulo, and he was isolated in Sao Paulo until he was imprisoned. And he tried to have a simple life. So he was in a very small neighborhood, in Georgine's neighborhood. He had a low profile father. Well, he tried to keep a very quiet life, not to call the attention from the Brazilian justice. Like in the other cases of Lava Jatos, the justice is far from being perfect to prosecute them. So we need a lot of cooperation at international level in terms of justice. But we have to see what judges are going to decide because he was sentenced to 3 imprisonment years. So we don't know yet if he's gonna. We don't know if he's in Rio de Janeiro or any other state, or he went back to Sao Paulo. So that cooperation with the justice is expected now, expected by the authorities within the states. They had actions. They had all of them had certain contacts with Messer. So we have a lot of names there. All that's going to have a certain implication. With the contacts in Paraguay, in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro. So I'm going to give you the word back to you, so we could interact with our audience, and we could talk about more, elaborate more on that. Thank you, Vinicius. So before we go to the question itself, on this last point, I would like to ask a question that Ricardo Matias, agent from the Federal Police, sent me. He made some statements, getting to know what is for you to elaborate. For Steve, he says, PCC is formed by the articulation in network and not organized by the criminal companies. This is so true that when you grab or you catch one of the leaders, so it would not change anything in their structure. So he even complements that the idea of survival of PCC is because of the lack of the capacity from the public power to control that phenomenon. So, and they also deny the existence of PCC at a given moment. So, there I have that question for Steve, which is about the PCC. Let me see. We have some other questions. It's still with the PCC for Vinicius. What's the process of transnationalization of PCC after the pandemics? Another question for Steve. The PCC would be involved in the financing and support from to politicians like they do in Central America with the big gangs there. Steve, could you talk a little bit more about the approximation, the approaching of PCC and these other cartels, Mexican cartels? So I wanted to ask a question myself to complement this block, talking about the Lava Jato operation. So on this moment, so we are in Brazil. We know we are having a kind of denounces of irregularities committed throughout the operation. And it's paradoxical right now because at the same time that never in the history of Brazil, the contractors who from they have like this type of empire involved in the businesses with they had a lot of contact with the public power. For the first time, they were touched somehow effectively by an investigation. So many of them were imprisoned. So, for example, Marcelo Odebrecht, and until they reached certain agreements. On the other hand, so it's obvious that something that never had happened before in Brazil. On the other hand, it's obviously complex process that we cannot refer to now. So with our current president, it's still a political issue behind it, behind Lava Jato, everything that took place in Lava Jato. So, and the current president, exactly, so he made the various interventions that in one way or another, they undermine the autonomy of institutions that were leaders in the Lava Jato operations. So, for example, former ministers like Sergio Moro, that we talk about, now he is the minister from Bolsonaro. So uh, he retired because he did not want to continue with Bolsonaro. So because he was not in the triple list. So we have the Federal Association, all of government, previous governments, and the PT, which was the most affected party by the Lava Jato operations. So this time, Bolsonaro, um, if you want to have someone there in the list, and the way on the last 2 years, we had a series of allegations within the national federal income and the de-articulation of QUAR, which it talks about we have certain organs or entities to investigate money laundering, and they are fundamental for the Lava Jato operation. So I wanted to hear what you make of that, from that paradoxical situation, to say how that could be a framework, and to produce something that one way or another is somehow the opposite of what's happening. So I leave the questions with another thing, Vinicius, for you. The PCC historically is seen by specialists as it's made of inmates and criminals who come from the poor population, from the suburbs. So they are doing some years in prison. So that's the base from the population, but that's the most vulnerable margin or layer of the population. So it was questioned somehow if it was real or not that the PCC would be a special protagonist in that international action and traffic of cocaine with a lot of resources. Many people question if whether it would be possible that criminals, poor criminals, could be involved in these schemes that historically have kind of a facade of business and also work with big business groups. people with high acquisition power and who are not in prison, but they belong to economic elite that even that's political. So, for example, we talk about Ellie Koch, that they have a kind of army in Brazil. So, for you, the question is which would be the connection between that business level that you consider that belongs to a political elite and the PCC, that to have that connection, that person there, where you have that connection. So I know I made a lot of questions and I talked a lot, but now I'm going to give you the word now. Now, Vinicius, please answer this question. Then Steve, please.
Bom,
Okay.
vamos lá. Muito boas questões, né?
Okay, we have a lot of very
Eu
good
vou começar
questions. I'm
pelo
going to
fato
start by the
do
fact
nosso
that
amigo que interagiu,
our
né?
friend who
Sobre o
interacted with
PCC ser
us
uma empresa, de
about the
fato,
PCC being
acredito que eles
a
tenham
company
feito o
itself, I
PCC.
think PCC
É isso, ele
is,
não necessita
they don't
que
need
toda a sua cadeia de
that all
comando
the chain
esteja
of
ligada,
command
porque
to be
você até
there,
comentou mais
because
cedo,
you
né,
commented
sobre o
before
fato
with
de
regards to the
o
fact that
PCC ter uma
PCC,
autorregulação
they had a
interna,
high
ele se
self-regulation internally, or they have they get feedback constantly, and they manage to act criminally without necessarily having to have a command chain of command, and that's very long to ask for authorizations. They set for certain general rules that are focused on a given moment, so they just activate them. So they just follow the general rules they have. I think that they already it's right it's already rooted in their organization. So the regulations are there. They just follow them. You follow them or you don't follow them. That's why they are framed within a more business-like action. So when we have a person who is not, they're not conjugating the same verb within the organization, they're just eliminated.
sobre a transnacionalização do grupo,
With regards to
eu
the
aqui queria
transnationalization of the
tentar
group,
mesclar com a
I
sua
would
última
like to try
pergunta,
to mix with your last
de
question.
fato,
As a
eu
matter of
acho que
fact,
nesse
I
ponto o
think that
PCC
that
é
point, the
composto
PCC,
por
is made up
variados tipos de
by
pessoas de
several
diferentes
kinds of
classes,
people from
só
different
que
social
hoje,
strata,
e foi até acentuado
but it
durante
was
o Covid,
focused at
no
the
PCC,
we had a lot of people, but because of the
representantes
COVID, we had
estão
certain
cada vez
differences.
mais,
The
eu poderia
representatives
dizer,
are, we could say
internalizando o
that
grupo, né?
they are more
Estão
internalized.
trazendo o
They are
grupo para
bringing
esses
a
grandes
group together so
representantes
that those
do
big
mundo da
representatives
cocaína,
from the
da
cocaine
maconha,
world, from the
das
marijuana
drogas
world,
sintéticas, ele
from that synthetic
consiga
drugs
distribuir, né,
that
dar
they managed to
vazão, o
distribute,
que não necessariamente
what
quer dizer que
because
esse
not
seja um
necessarily means
grupo
that they are
transnacional de
a
traficantes.
transnational group
Tem
necessarily. No,
membros
from
na
uh,
Europa,
the
membros
standpoint, they may have
em
members in
várias partes do
Europe or
mundo.
in
O
several
que a
parts
gente
of the world.
percebe é que
What
os
we see
intermediários
is that
hoje
intermediaries
estão com
today
muito poder.
are
Então, de
they have a
alguma
lot of
forma, isso
power. So
pode
one way or
impactar a
another, so yes, they could
transnacionalização do
have
grupo.
some actions internationally,
Independente,
but not
obviamente,
necessarily
de
are internationalized. But that depends
um nível alto
on
de
the high
autonomia, que sabe
level
falar
of
inglês,
autonomy.
eventualmente
They have a lot of members who
sejam
speak good
muito
English, for
qualificados.
example, and they're
Só
very
que o que a
well
gente percebe
articulated.
é
That's what we see.
cada
What we could
vez
see is that
mais
increasingly
poder dentro da
they
mão
have more
desses grandes
power
representantes
within
das
the
drogas.
organization as the
E aí, de
representative of the
novo,
drug dealing.
sigo para a pergunta sobre a
And I
questão
go
sobre a
with the
Lava
next
Jato, que é mais,
questions
acho, até para
regarding Lava
refletir
Jato. I think it's more
propriamente
for
para
reflecting that rather
ter
than for
uma
giving an
resposta
answer,
definitiva,
a final
mas
answer.
a Lava Jato se
However,
percebe
Lava
que ela
Jato is
só
seen
foi
that
possível
it was only
porque
possible
tinha,
because they
existiam
had
instituições que
institutions
propiciavam esse
who
tipo de atividade
favored this
dentro do
type of
mundo
activities
político, dentro do
in
mundo
the
do
political
judiciário.
realm, in
Então,
the
o caso Messi vem
judiciary
nessa
realm.
esteira,
So,
ele vem nessa esteira de
so,
cooperação
so they
dentro do nosso
need to have
relatório
a
que nós
cooperation
desenvolvemos
within our
conjuntamente.
report. Well, we
As
explain that
autoridades
authorities
paraguaias
from
enviaram um
Paraguay,
relatório
they
de
sent
inteligência
an
para
intelligence
as
report
autoridades
for the
brasileiras
Brazilian
e
authorities,
alertaram, ó,
and
Dali
they
saiu
warned them,
do
okay,
Paraguai,
master
acho que ele está aí
left
no São
Paraguay. I
Paulo,
think
no Rio
he's
de
in Sao
Janeiro, não
Paulo.
sei.
Rio de Janeiro.
E
I
aí
don't know.
as
But
autoridades
their
brasileiras
authorities from
mobilizaram o
Brazil,
seu aparato, instituição, até o
they
próprio
activated
civil,
their legal
para
framework
tentar
for
traçar um
mapping,
cronograma
and
de
they
busca.
had
E
a
vale
search
lembrar
plan
que Messer foi procurado pela
because Master
justiça no
was
ano de
looked by
2018.
the
Então
Justice
a
Department
justiça
in
não o
2018,
achou, só foi
but they didn't
concluída
find
no
him.
ano de
So he was just,
2019.
they could only get him in
Então a gente tem
2019.
que lembrar que
So we
as
have to
instituições
remember
fortes
that
propiciam
strong
ações cada
institutions
vez
favor
mais fortes,
actions
né?
that are
E a gente
stronger.
percebe que, de
And
fato,
we
se
can
olhando
see that,
por
as a matter of
exemplo, sem
fact,
partido
yes,
político, sem ministério
we,
público,
without any political
o
party,
nosso
if
contexto
they are more
atual, a gente
independent in
percebe
our
que há, de
context, we
fato,
could see that
enfraquecimento das
there are
instituições. Concordo, a
certain
gente percebe
weakening
que
of certain institutions.
existem
And there are
instituições que antes
institutions that before
galgavam o
uh,
caminho e
they
agora
had they
vêm
would
sendo
show the
situadas
way,
cada vez
but now
mais
they have
fragmentadas
less
e tem uma
budget
atuação
to
cada vez
act,
mais cirúrgica
and they
para
have
não
a more a
desperdiçar
lighter
recursos.
kind of
E eu aprendi
actions
isso
that
no
they
meu
have.
país também, mas enfim, a gente tem
And
que ver isso num
we
nível
need to
macro
understand
e
that from the
perceber que, de
macro
fato, as
perspective
instituições
and
de
see
antes
that
que
previous
possibilitaram
institutions
a atuação de
possibilitated the
prender um
action
grande doleiro
to
como Paulo Mestre,
undertake this
talvez não
prosecution
seja
process.
possível num
Perhaps it is not
prazo aí
possible
de
in a short
3,
term, in
5
two
anos,
or
estamos
5 years.
pensando médio e longo prazo.
That,
Então,
so
parte disso
the
a gente lembra também
so
que
we
esse
remember also
paradoxo da Lava
remember that
Jato,
the paradox
ela
of
é um
Lava Jato,
paradoxo, e se
it's a
sua autoria
paradox.
é o presidente Bolsonaro, ele também
And
acaba sendo
President
um
Bolsonaro ends up being
paradoxal,
a
porque
paradoxical
é uma
figure.
pessoa que
So because he's the
prega
person that calls
por
for
grandes,
a great
por aumentar a massa
to
carcerária e tudo
increase
mais, e ao mesmo tempo a gente
the
vê
number of
o movimento
prison
do
population.
governo em
So we have a lot of movements,
flexibilizar
and to flexibilize
o acesso
the
a armamento.
access to weapons,
Essa flexibilização
that
são
flexibilization, that change of category, for example,
armamentos que eram
of
diferentes
weapons that were
passou a de
restricted
uso
from
a de uso para o civil, né,
from the
civil.
legal
A gente
authorities
percebe
towards
que
the civil
sim,
society.
a legislação
Well,
ela
we have to say
recua,
that legislation
a
is kind
legislação
of
penal ela
flexible.
recua. A gente percebe
It's
que
going
menos
backwards, I
pessoas que
think. So we
respondiam
have fewer
ao crime
people that you
vão
could
continuar
use there.
respondendo,
So we're
vão
going to continue answering to
ser
that.
beneficiadas e
So
serão
we have a lot of people who are going to be
prisioneiros.
benefited
Então a
by
gente
that.
percebe que tem paradoxo. É
So that's a
presidente
paradox.
que
It's a
fala
precedent that
sobre
talks
aumentar a massa
about
carcerária,
increasing
mas ao
the
mesmo tempo
number
ele
of inmates in prisons,
passa
and at the same time,
a
he
base do seu
approves
governo
a
de
measure
flexibilização de acesso
to
à arma,
flexibilize
onde pessoas que
access
tinham
to
controle
weapons
de
to
posse,
commit crimes,
posse de
basically.
arma,
So
não mais
on
precisarem
possession of
sair do sistema
weapons.
prisional. Então a questão é bem
So,
complexa,
so it's a very complex
mas fica a
question,
reflexão.
but we need to reflect on
Há
that.
instituições
I
fortes
think that
para
strong
poder
institutions
coibir a atuação de
they
alguns,
act
porque
also
senão,
to
de fato, cada vez eles
somehow
vão ficar na elite
limit
do ponto de
the
vista
actions from the elite.
não de que eles tenham muito
No,
dinheiro,
it
não de que
is that they
eles
have more
tomem
money or anything
condições.
like that. It's not
Então,
about
isso
that.
é
So it's from
necessário
the
que estejam
standpoint that
as
is
justiças para poder
necessary to have control on that.
Só para fechar, a gente já está falando.
We need
Pode
to
fechar
close. We
agora.
ran out of time. Okay, about to finish.
Steve,
Steve.
Não, só para falar uma coisa.
No, just to mention something here that has to do with the main question that we ask ourselves. We had a discussion on how to talk about crime in Brazil, and we decided that it is important to show the part from the elites because we have a lot of emphasis from those who were investigating crime in Brazil. So we have a way, we have certain approach towards PCC and the groups and all that. But elites are part of that criminal world in Brazil. It's a very important part of that. They do not mix directly, or they don't have direct businesses with PCC or with the political elites. No, we didn't find that. Nevertheless, Brazilian justice, they have a certain link, direct link with what happens with the PCC. So elites want a Brazilian justice that's strong, robust, when they have to do with the PCC, but when it has to be with themselves, they don't want a robust, strong Brazilian justice. And that link, That's the being, that's the link. The way and the contradiction for us is that the idea that there should be a prison system, justice system in Brazil that's very strong, so just for them to a certain point, and there shouldn't be, and that's something. It's a contradiction that leaves space for the PCC itself. So both at ideological level as well as physical level in the same prison system, for example. They allow certain injustices before them, but not with regards to their own elites. So that's the connection that we see between the PCC and the crimes committed by the elite.
Steve, você ainda vai fazer encerramento?
Okay, Steve, would you like to close?
Oi.
Você quer
To
falar
wrap
alguma
up.
coisa pro encerramento?
But could you make a comment just to wrap up? No, really. I think that we need to close. We need to close the webinar in this moment. I would like to thank the participation of Vinicius and all the research that we made in the webinar today. And you also, Camilo. Thank you very much for Camila for being with us today. It was very special to have you.
Eu que agradeço.
Okay, I wanted to thank from the Inside Crime invitation. Angela, it is a pleasure to be with Vinicius. I all just want to remember something. Well, we didn't talk about the militia, but it's a next research to do, page Bruno. We need to read the Bruno's book, and certainly we need to talk about those criminal actors in Brazil that ends up destroying somehow the Red Command. In that way, we already ran out of time, but I really thank you, all of you, who are watching these, remembering that Inside Crime is still there with this type of presentations, and they could attend the event you have. Next week, you can see the results, and we could see the transporter crime. This is going to happen in March 16 at 4 o'clock Argentina time. Thank you very much. And boa tarde. Good afternoon. Okay, I hope you all keep well.